Heated Rivalry has often been criticized as having no hockey in it at all, but I would actually disagree. Heated Rivalry has had this unexpected effect of a lot of new hockey fans coming out of the show. And I say unexpected because I would say it was unexpected to a certain group of people. To me, this is a pattern we've been watching for a really long time. I've been doing a series on here for over a year about how sports romance has actively involved a new group of fans and welcomed them to sports as a gateway. But Heated Rivalry is 100% the biggest, largest scale version of this we've ever seen. Which is why I've been doing this series breaking down every episode of Heated Rivalry, all of the context of the hockey in it, how it does hockey so well and teaches you a little bit of hockey along the way, and how the show wouldn't work if it were set in any sport or setting other than hockey itself. This video is breaking down episode 4, which means if this is the first time you've ever seen me, first of all, hello, I'm Marissa and I make content that makes sports more accessible to people who've never felt welcome in that space. Second of all, if you want to watch the other 3 episodes in order, so the episodes breaking down the first 2 episodes with Shane and Ilya, and last week's episode breaking down Scott and Kip's relationship, be sure to go back and watch those either now or after you finish this video. But if you have been following along every single week, welcome back. And of course, it's time to break down the tuna melt, so buckle up for your tummy to hurt because mine is in a bad mood. First off, I do want to point out the previously on cut of this episode and a couple of things that they highlight going into this one. I will say that on my first watch, when I was watching this show as it was coming out, I actually usually skip the previously on. But last episode, when we talked about episode 3 and Scott Hunter and his relationship with the boys and kind of his setup, I actually realized that they do a pretty good job of the previously ons on this show, and also a lot of it really highlights a lot of that hockey context. Going into this episode, when we look at the previously on, a lot of it actually focuses on Ilya's relationship with his father and a lot of the frustration that would have been coming out of the Olympics and his major loss there. It also highlights this idea of his connection to shame, failure, and hockey, and how that shame and failure when it comes to hockey is really forced by his father. I think that's actually pretty important context going into this episode, and especially for one of the softer moments that we get between him and Shane. Because as we head into the very beginning of this episode, it's important to remember where Ilya's headspace is. He and Shane's relationship has, from the very beginning, as we've discussed, been about who is winning and who has the most kind of tallies in their own win column. And it's a good time to look back at how that affects their relationship. At the very beginning of this show, when they first meet in episode 1, they're already being pitted against each other when it comes to the Prospect Cup. As a reminder, the International Prospect Cup stands in here for the real life World Juniors, which is a real situation where you would see these teenage prospects being kind of pitted against each other and discussed as we're looking for who's going to come into the NHL and who's going to have the highest draft pick. As we know, Ilya beats Shane in that first meeting, and he does so on home turf in Canada. Ilya also ends up then going first overall in the draft, but prior to their season actually starting, Shane and Ilya go up against each other again at the International Prospect Cup, and Shane comes away with the win. I wanted to reflect back on that because when we look at the Olympics, we actually have a complete mirror of that situation. When Ilya and Shane first meet, Shane is the one to seek him out at the very beginning before the competition starts. And they start their relationship out from Shane trying to be sort of sportsmanlike, but also trying to size up the competition. And Ilya, being Ilya, says, "You're not going to be so nice when we beat you," which he then does follow through on that promise. But from the very beginning, they go back and forth, trading these devastating blows when it comes to their hockey victories. Ilya starts their relationship out by embarrassing Shane and his team on home turf. And when we go to the Olympics, Ilya sort of has that favor returned because, as we remember, the Olympics were actually hosted in Sochi in Russia in 2014. And Ilya's performance and the real-life Russian performance in the Olympics was devastatingly bad, and they don't even make it to a medal game. So as we're going into a new season and going into episode 4 at the start, it's important to remember that Ilya is dealing with so much of that shame and frustration coming out of the Olympics. And as we see from the previously on, his father's kind of words of disappointment are hanging over him. So of course, we then open up on a game that starts right after the Olympic break. Ilya and Shane are on the ice at the same time, and the Boston Raiders are beating the Montreal Metros already. Quickly, Ilya scores, and then we actually have this face-off moment where Ilya talks a little bit of smack ahead of the face-off itself. I actually love how many of these moments that we get throughout Heated Rivalry, these moments where we're seeing two centers square off and talk a little bit of smack, because this is something that you will see in hockey games. So much of hockey, and really any competitive sport, is about the mental game. Trash talk is a huge part of that, and there's something even more charged, of course, in that relationship when we have Shane and Ilya being the ones to talk trash. There is, of course, a little bit of an edge that they both have when distracting each other due to their off-ice relationship. And of course, that's where we get this iconic Ilya line, where he asks if he should wait to score his hat trick or do it now. I did get a couple of questions about what a hat trick is on the last episode, and I apologize for not explaining. A hat trick is just 3 goals scored in the same game by the same player. So Ilya does, of course, score that goal, which means that he gets a hat trick on that game, and it ends with the game being 4-1 with a Boston win. We also get a couple of fun notes from the announcers, one of which being that Shane was on the ice for all 3 of Ilya's goals. Now, I know I've mentioned before in some of the other episodes that this show uses the commentating and the sort of man in the crease podcast very frequently to get a lot of sort of hockey exposition out. And this is one of the moments that's actually pretty fun to point out. Hockey is kind of similar to basketball in the sense that we actually get players moving in and out of the ice very frequently, and you're not always going to see the same players from each side on the ice at the same time. Very frequently, of course, you will, but hockey teams are broken up into different lines. So just a refresher from some of the things that we've talked about before, hockey teams have 5 skaters on the ice and 1 goalie at a time. And you have 2 separate lines that are on the ice at all times. Your first is your forward line, or your offensive players, which is made up of your center, your left wing, and your right wing. And your second is your defensive line, which are the other 2 players. Now, those lines are changed very frequently, and we don't stop the game to actually kind of switch our players out. You'll see that in this episode and in this game itself, where you actually see them jumping over the boards and swapping out. But your lines are generally made up and kind of comprised together with different strengths. Shane and Ilya are certainly both on their first line, and they both play the same position, which is center. But because of how line changes work, it doesn't mean that Ilya and Shane are always on the ice at the exact same time. Generally, a shift change can be sort of around 30 to 45 seconds. That's the amount of time that one group of guys is going to stay on the ice before swapping out. And that's because we want to have the freshest legs on the ice at all times. And so you're constantly going to see guys jumping over the boards and being swapped out for the next line. For Shane to have been on the ice for every single one of Ilya's goals, it means that they were consistently putting him out there and putting his line out there, hoping that he would be able to not only score his own goals, but to stop Ilya in what seems to be a game where they absolutely steamrolled them. And I think a lot of that game context really shows through in their relationship, because as much as this is sort of them going back and forth and taunting each other, it's also them flirting a little bit. We know kind of as the viewer that they're going to meet up after this, and we get a montage of that happening throughout all of their games, which comes in pretty quickly after this. But we also know that their competition has this level of them constantly expecting the other person to be the one to stop them. Shane's coach and Shane's team looks at him as their superstar, and they look at Ilya as his direct competition and consistently hope that he's the better player, which means that whenever they're playing against each other, it's almost a little bit worse than playing anyone else. A loss against Ilya and the Boston Raiders is always going to sting a little bit more than a loss against another team, not only because of their rivalry, but also because of their standings. As we've talked about before, the Boston Raiders and the Montreal Metros are in the same division, which means that to get to a Stanley Cup, they have to fight against each other every single time. And the way that the ranking system and getting to the playoffs works in the NHL, and by extension the MLH, is that every game is worth points. Teams earn 2 points for winning a game and 1 point for losing a game in overtime, and they earn 0 points for losing a game in regulation. So at the end of this game, Boston takes home 2 points and Montreal takes home 0. We look at those points to then say, okay, where do we rank all of these teams, and which teams make it into the playoffs based on those accrued points throughout the entire season. So every 2-point win that Boston takes home or Montreal takes home is a 2-point advantage against them getting into the playoffs, which is to say that every single one of these games that they play against each other comes with so much pressure. And that small note of Shane being on the ice for every single one of Ilya's goals also highlights how much more personal pressure Shane and Ilya have from their teams and their coaches when they're playing directly against each other. And of course, we get a nice highlight of what the narrative would have been if this were a real hockey game. Ilya is coming off of this devastating loss, and Shane's coming off a pretty good performance in the Olympics. The narrative coming back would have been about how Ilya is probably going to need to play better. Is he capable of bouncing back from his Olympic disaster? Can Shane continue to highlight his Canadian hockey skills as they go back into the league? And again, of course, as soon as we have a head-to-head comparison, which does appear to have happened pretty quickly after the Olympic break would have been over, that narrative is going to be even more dramatic. Now, one thing I do want to point out about the timeline is how the Olympic break works. The Olympics actually happen in the middle of the NHL season, which means that in an Olympic year, we end up having a much more condensed schedule. At the beginning of the season, teams are playing more games at a quicker pace in order to make up for the 2 weeks that they have to take off to go to the Olympics. Then after the Olympics, everybody comes back, and the guys that have been on the Olympic team obviously are a lot less rested than everyone else. However, because of how the progression of the tournament works in the Olympics, guys who got eliminated earlier on come back home earlier and return to practice with their teams earlier. So of course, you have this sort of split advantage. Shane ended up going all the way through the medal rounds, which means that he would have been playing for Canada at the Olympics until the very last day of the tournament. Ilya, having gotten knocked out, probably would have had to return to Boston to report for practice, because even though there is an Olympic break, practice does start back up prior to the Olympics being over, with everybody on their teams that didn't get selected for their Olympic country teams. So Ilya would have come back from Russia with all of the disappointment of his his father on his shoulders, all of the disappointment of his country on his shoulders, and returned to Boston as sort of a man unleashed. Shane would have come back probably almost a week later, exhausted from that tournament, and if we go based off of what we think happened based off of the books, probably only putting a silver medal around his neck. However, all of that being said, this game that happens right after the Olympic break is actually going to be pretty quickly after that. So we know that Shane and Ilya had their meetup at Shane's apartment kind of before the Olympics. They mention the Olympics and the fact that they won't talk while they're there. And then at the Olympics, they have this frustrating moment where Shane is upset that Ilya is ignoring him and ignoring his text messages. And they have that sort of direct confrontation of not wanting to talk to each other. And then kind of weirdly, if we look at the timeline for this, and this just might be me misunderstanding the way that everything's laid out, I think this game happens after the Olympics and Ilya kind of beats him. Then after this, we go back to the end of episode 2 where we have the MLH Awards, and then we go into this montage of summer 2014, which would be after the MLH Awards. The MLH Awards are famously the "we didn't even kiss" scene, so this game I think happens in between the Olympics and the MLH Awards, and then we jump into that summer 2014 montage. All of which is to say, all is kind of forgiven from the Olympics and the ghosting as we jump into this really long montage that starts with summer of 2014. So a couple of things that come out of this montage that I really liked hockey context-wise. One, the overall flow of this montage shows not only the kind of differences between Shane and Ilya, but also the progression of Shane and Ilya and their obsession with each other as it grows over the next couple of years. At the beginning, we get Ilya framed as a party boy who's using all of his off-season to party with Svetlana and other women, and of course we get Shane framed as a rigid sort of golden boy of hockey. Ilya is doing shots while Shane is reading books, he's partying with Svetlana as Shane is doing brand deals, and of course we're seeing Shane constantly in the gym and working out. We also get a couple of hockey sequences as Shane's hockey profile starts to rise. One thing I love that they included was this clip of Shane saying yup yup and getting the goal right afterwards. If you don't watch hockey or this is your first time watching hockey, that's him calling for the puck and letting his teammate know that he's open. You'll also see hockey players do this in general by tapping their stick on the ice. They're just trying to make a noise to let their teammate know that they're ready for the puck and that they have an open shot. So it was really fun to see Shane actually do that and get a little bit of a hockey kind of moment in that space. In the 2014 part of this montage, we see that Shane wins the cup, which is the first time in 16 years for the Metros, which also goes back to that All-Star conference that we saw earlier on in this show, where they talk about how both of them are on original 6 teams and that neither of them have been able to bring a cup or get to the playoffs in a long time. So we see Shane's golden boy act kind of pay off. He's the one who takes the cup home, and of course we have Ilya watching from home. And again, it's a good reminder that every single time one of them makes it to the Stanley Cup, it's either because during the regular season Shane outperformed Ilya, or because they directly played against each other in the playoffs and Shane won. And of course we get a montage of kissing and hockey back and forth over the next 2 seasons. Shane takes home back-to-back Stanley Cups, and this actually is a huge deal. Not only has he brought this team back from sort of the brink of oblivion with the fact that they hadn't been able to win a Stanley Cup in 16 years and were barely ever making it into the playoffs in the first place, but we hear the announcers say, is it too early to call it a dynasty? Not since Chicago in the late 90s have we seen a team do back-to-back cups. Now, in the real world, the Chicago Blackhawks have never won back-to-back Stanley Cups. However, again, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of changed and moved around just to make sure that they're not too close to the NHL, since they weren't allowed to actually use NHL teams and branding in this show. But for a little bit of context in terms of like how many teams have ever won back-to-back Stanley Cups, last year the Florida Panthers won the Stanley Cup, which made it their first time going back-to-back. Before that, we had the Tampa Bay Lightning go back-to-back, and the last team to go back-to-back Stanley Cups in the 2000s were the Pittsburgh Penguins. But in the late 90s, there was a team that went back-to-back, and that was the Detroit Red Wings. They also have a lot of fun lore on that team, including throwing octopuses on ice during the Stanley Cup Finals. But it's kind of fun to look back at how many teams have actually managed to go back-to-back and realize that it's a pretty stressful feat. And not only that, but when we're talking about NHL parallels, there has not been a Canadian team in the NHL that has won the Stanley Cup since 1993. And if you were wondering which Canadian team most recently brought home the Stanley Cup in 1993, you would be correct in guessing that it was the Montreal Canadiens. So there's this fun thing of sort of referencing how big of a deal it would be for a team to go back-to-back. But if this really was in the NHL and it was happening in 2014 and 2015, this would have been the first team to go back-to-back since the late 90s. And in the real world parallel, at the exact same seasons, the Pittsburgh Penguins and Sidney Crosby took home their back-to-back championship run, becoming the first team to do it since Detroit in the late 90s. So there are little moments like this, really little moments throughout the series where you can feel so much hockey knowledge, like puck knowledge in an extreme way, that I will tell you it wouldn't be possible to create a character like Shane Hollander if it weren't for Rachel Reed understanding so much about hockey, and Jacob Tierney, of course, respecting that and also knowing so much about hockey himself. There is so much little hockey history, little NHL history throughout this show that it's almost mind-blowing, and you miss so much of it even just on your first run. The idea that Shane takes home back-to-back cups for the first time in a long time, in pretty much the same timeline that Sidney Crosby was doing the same thing with the Pittsburgh Penguins. I just have to tell you, my dream is to sit down with Rachel Reed and just talk about hockey for 100 hours. The woman is an encyclopedia and did such a good job of building a world that is adjacent to the NHL without being exactly the same. And then of course we get to the end of this montage, which is summer of 2016, after Shane has just won his second cup, where he texts Ilya and tells him not to work too hard because he's going to win again. I love again how we have so many of these moments where it's so wrapped up in their competition, in their rivalry, but also in the fact that their flirting is so directly connected to their relationship on the ice. This is also the first portion of the montage where we see Ilya completely disinterested in other women, where he's on his phone during all of the partying, where we see his father for the first time in this montage, and where we see him starting to work out to the same degree that we're seeing Shane do. As they start to ignite this competition, and of course as Ilya's life is starting to show cracks overall. And we see that the two things he's focused on the most are hockey and Shane. And then we kick off the 2016-2017 season with October of 2016. So going into the beginning of the 2016 season, we have this hilarious moment where Shane is recognized but Hayden isn't by two teenage girls that want to take a photo with him. And I did kind of love this moment because one of the things that I think is very funny about hockey in particular is that generally speaking, if you saw those men walking down the street, you probably wouldn't recognize them. I talked about this specifically in the last episode talking about Scott and Kip, where I did say that it was funny that Kip didn't recognize Scott given the fact that his father is this huge Admirals fan, and he said that he watched the playoffs. A lot of people pointed out that they wear helmets, and I will say that I think captains are going to be very recognizable if you are a fan of the team or watching the games, especially because you're going to see them giving interviews, being close up, and if you're a fan, you're going to recognize them. But there's something hilarious about Shane being recognized and Hayden not being recognized immediately in this situation. Partially just because obviously Shane is the star of the team, the captain of the team, and Hayden is on the same team. However, the other part that this is actually really relevant about in terms of the demographic that we're seeing recognize him, as well as Shane's profile, is that Shane as a hockey player is probably one of the most recognized players in the league, and one that actually steps outside of your typical hockey fan. Because Shane has so many endorsement deals that we're constantly seeing him film, and that we see a number of in this sort of montage just before this. Shane is the face of two commercials in this montage, including an underwear line and a soda. And in that soda commercial, he is soaking wet and actively sprayed with more water. And of course, also Rolex is mentioned in this episode, and we know that Reebok is mentioned a number of times, and Speedo later in the season. Shane's face and body is probably everywhere in a way that a lot of NHL players aren't. And in a couple of quick moments in this episode, we see that highlighted not only in Shane being recognized by these teenage girls, but also in Ilya watching this sort of architectural digest profile of his house. Shane's public profile is so large, and in a way that it kind of escapes containment when we're talking about hockey, which is again another reason why Shane would be so afraid of their relationship getting out as their relationship continues to grow. There is so much that Shane views as something to lose, and that comes with this big profile. And one thing I will say is that of course my perception of NHL players and their fame is a little bit different because of the fact that I live in the States and not in Canada. I will say that I do think in Canada it's probably a lot more frequent that hockey players have this larger profile, and especially because I grew up in LA watching hockey, which is just not a hockey city, despite the fact that we have 2 Stanley Cups. All of that being said, hockey players are like completely built up underneath pads and helmets and on skates. So if you just saw one of these guys walking down the street, like Hayden in particular, especially with a bunch of kids in an aquarium, he's going to be a couple inches shorter than you expect him to be, there's no helmet guarding his face, and he looks a lot less bulky than you would expect because he's usually under these pads. And so Shane being recognized in this space, especially with Hayden not being recognized by the same people, and so much of this highlight of all of his commercials, his brand deals, really reminds us how big of a profile Shane has. And I would argue that it's bigger than the typical NHL player's footprint, especially when we're talking about the mainstream and the general public recognizing him, whether they're huge hockey fans or not. So then of course we get to the Boston road trip where Shane is going to go see Ilya and ruin everyone's evening. I hate ending this episode without playing the next one. However, there was one diabolical moment that I wanted to point out with Hayden, and that is the fact that in this room that they are sharing on this road trip, Hayden puts his suitcase on one bed and opens it. Then when Shane leaves, flops onto the other bed with all his outside clothes and his shoes on, while implying that he's going to have some super special alone time. And if that doesn't tell you that Hayden is Shane's best friend for some confusing reason, I don't know what else to tell you. That man takes his shoes off as soon as he enters a home, and he actively talks about how the sheets are dirty after trysts. Hayden and I could not be friends because outside clothes and shoes on a bed that you're going to sleep on, not acceptable. If you want to put it on your own bed along with your suitcase, that's fine, but leave my man alone. That has nothing to do with the hockey context of this episode, it's just a personal feeling, so we're gonna move on. In this section where Ilya convinces Shane to stay over, saying saying that they don't have a morning practice because they have an afternoon game, we get a lot of actually like domestic hockey in a really interesting way. Every moment of this situation is very clearly mapped out by Ilya with the intent of trying to start something new, and ultimately it obviously does backfire. However, I really loved how much hockey they talk in their sort of domestic situation and how we get a relaxed amount of sharing in terms of their lives that we wouldn't normally see from them. Up until this point, the only time we see them really discussing anything is just to be competitive. We see them texting about hockey and about beating each other. We see them talk about their road game schedule. We see them track each other's hockey progress. And we see these kind of slight moments where Ilya's maybe paying attention to Shane a little bit, or Shane is paying attention to Ilya. But we really don't see them have any sort of conversation that's just about their likes, dislikes, or interests until now. But we do notice all of these little things that Ilya notices about Shane, of course. Things like having ginger ale stocked in the house, and knowing how to sort of ease him into a domestic situation. Ilya basically sets up a perfect Shane scenario. I will feed you, I will give you ginger ale, and we will sit down and watch your favorite TV show, which in fact is hockey. And you get a lot of tentative questions as Ilya sets this up. The dialogue in this sequence is so good because so much of it is Ilya understanding kind of what the safe subjects are with Shane, and also understanding that Shane's favorite subject is in fact hockey. So we get little questions about his schedule, and Shane talks about basically the long road trip that they're on, which is very normal for hockey. Shane's in Boston now for a game tomorrow against Ilya himself, and then they head to Tampa, then Sunrise, then Dallas, then St. Louis. This is a pretty typical thing that would be happening in a hockey schedule. We have these runs where they have a couple of games at home and then they go on a long road trip. And I think it's a good thing to remember, not jumping ahead, but a little bit of spoilers for episode 6, where they start to build this plan where Ilya is going to move to Ottawa to only be 2 hours away from Shane. That to remember that also they're both going to be on different teams, which means completely different schedules and these insane road trip schedules as well. Even if they're living 2 hours apart from each other, there's still going to be these sections where they're gone for weeks at a time, where Shane may have a week-long road trip, then come back home to Montreal only for Ilya to have another week-long road trip at the same time. I think their schedule being constantly highlighted in this show is not only realistic, but it also gives you a reminder of what their lives are going to look like as long as they're living in secret, no matter what. Shane and Ilya are professional athletes. They're two of the biggest stars in this league, and they're constantly going to be traveling, going on road trips, maintaining morning practice as well as games. There's so much going on in their schedules that even if things were exactly perfect, like they start to plan out at the end of this season, they're still going to have a lot of trouble being able to see each other and build a real relationship. Then we get a lot of hockey talk in this section where they're on the couch and watching hockey. They talk about Ryan Price, who's referenced as a player who is constantly being traded and currently is playing for Buffalo. Now, this is where we get into one of my favorite hockey consequences of this show, because we talk a lot about how heated rivalry has affected real life hockey. And in this moment, when this episode airs, Ilya and Shane change the course of the NHL and this season's playoffs. Because in this moment, Shane makes a joke that actually makes Ilya laugh. And not only does that change the course of history for their relationship, it also rocks the entire space-time continuum for the actual NHL season and this year's playoffs. We're told that Ryan Price is on Buffalo. Ilya says that he probably wants to get traded again because Buffalo sucks. And Shane replies that their team isn't good either. What you may not realize is that at the time of this episode airing, the Buffalo Sabres appeared to have basically no chance of getting into the playoffs. Since this episode aired, they went on the most insane run ever and continued to win games, and now, not only are they definitely going to make the playoffs, they are number 1 in their division and number 2 in their conference. But not only did Buffalo take this personally, in the rest of their conversation, Shane and Ilya referenced 6 more cities that they personally enjoy going to. And from that moment on, they cursed every single one of those teams. Ilya says he likes New York, but that they hate him there. Both of the teams in New York, the New York Islanders and the New York Rangers, are currently not in the playoffs. Not only that, but the New York Rangers have been sucking so hard that they're not only last in their conference, they are ranked 30th out of 32 teams in the entirety of the NHL. When Shane says that they hate Ilya everywhere, he corrects him and says not in Florida. The Florida Panthers are actually back-to-back Stanley Cup champions and won last year. They are now currently ranked last in their division and second to last in their conference, ranked only higher than one team, which is, you guessed it, the New York Rangers. But of course, don't worry, there's no way that they also cursed my personal team, the LA Kings. Oh, wait, they did. Ilya said that he likes LA because there's lots of hot women there. And of course, we are currently battling it out for the last wildcard position in our conference as we desperately attempt to let our captain, who is retiring at the end of this season, make it into the playoffs one last time. And the only thing that I can hope is that Ilya cursing my team by trying to rage bait Shane into admitting that he likes him will end by the time that I finish this series. But you know what? That's just Ilya. Of course the curse couldn't go for both of them, could it? Worry not, of course it did. Shane mentions 3 cities that he likes to visit when on road games. Those are Ottawa, Toronto, and Winnipeg. All 3 of those teams currently will not make the playoffs if they started tomorrow. Toronto sits 14th in their conference, just ahead of the Florida Panthers and the New York Rangers. Winnipeg sits 12th in their conference, and Ottawa sits 10th in their conference. And depending on when you're watching this video, all of those rankings are relevant on the day of March 19th when I'm filming this video. And while I am upset that this is affecting my team personally, I am of course tickled that in the time it took for Ilya to cook 2 tuna melts, he and Shane changed the course of the entirety of the NHL. Okay, quick note from the future. As I was editing this video, the Kings managed to pop back into that wildcard spot. Things are still looking tight. Everyone please continue to manifest the fact that we are like literally going back and forth with the Sharks and the Kraken every single day. Please let Ilya's rage bait curse be broken, okay? In this conversation, we also get a reference back to Svetlana. And while Ilya may think that he's smooth, we literally watch him side-eye at Shane as he talks about the idea of being with another woman. But I also think it's hilarious that in this conversation, he almost sounds like he's soft launching a best friendship between Svetlana and Shane. He's like, oh, I know this lady. She's really nice to me. We hook up a lot. Actually, don't worry about that. We never would be anything serious, but you'll never believe this. She loves hockey. Her dad was a goalie and she knows everything about hockey. And then he goes one step further and is like, she's a big fan of you. This is so funny to me because as planned out as this conversation is, and as every little moment from the second that Shane walks through the door at Ilya's house feels so calculated and intentional, even bringing up Svetlana. There's this moment where you're screaming like, Ilya, what are we doing here? But in some ways, there's almost like a buried compliment in here. Ilya, of course, doesn't tell Shane that he is a great hockey player, but he will bring up a woman who Shane says sounds like a perfect match. Talk about how she knows everything about hockey, her dad is a famous goalie, and compliment Shane's hockey abilities through this woman that Shane has never met. I will say I can't wait until season 2 when Svetlana absolutely has to meet Shane and they sit there and they talk about hockey and how much they love it and they just go through like stat over stat over stat. My dream, in fact, for Shane Hollander's retirement is a hockey podcast that he hosts with himself, his mother, and Svetlana. I would listen to that every single day. And then the last nice moment that we get before Shane ruins my life is a callback actually to draft day. Shane basically says, you don't think you could find another woman to sleep with you. And Ilya says, maybe, but you know me, I'm lazy. And Shane smiles and says, I don't know that side of you at all. Now, this was such a moment that I really loved, because if we're being completely honest and we look at this relationship, Shane has never seen Ilya be lazy a moment in his life. In fact, the thing that consistently seems to attract Shane to Ilya is the fact that Ilya is the only person in the entire league that can hold a candle to Shane's work ethic and talent. The idea of Ilya believing himself to be lazy or even referencing that would be completely mind-blowing to Shane. Not only mind-blowing, but it just wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't add up. Ilya is the only person in the league that can really bring competition to Shane, and Shane knows how hard he works. Shane is, by and large, the only person really that could tell Ilya that he was lazy, and Ilya would be able to believe that factually. But he has this constant belief in himself that's been instilled by his dad that he's worthless, that he's lazy, and that the career that he's built for himself means nothing. In what should have been the biggest moment of Ilya's life up until that point, when Ilya's name is called first overall, even ahead of Shane, the first thing Ilya's father says to his coach is that Ilya is lazy. And Ilya immediately tries to get rid of that idea when he's talking to the coach. Now, all these years later, we have this same kind of idea reflected, and we know that Ilya has held on to that comment and truly believes it. But in just a moment of like a healing space, Shane is just genuinely honest. And he says, I don't know that side of you at all. Ilya isn't lazy. He is one of the best professional athletes in this league, sometimes second only to the man across the couch from him, who says he doesn't believe that he's lazy in any way, shape, or form. And it's a moment of healing, of peace, and something that only Shane could give him, because of the fact that he is the only person who would genuinely understand how hard Ilya has worked to get to this point. And even though we get a small smile from Ilya and a moment of healing, it is of course shattered moments later. Okay, so then we meet Rose, and we get a lot more hockey knowledge here too. Shane meets Rose in a bar right after this freak out, and in their conversation, it's like the first time that he seems to have had a conversation with a woman where he thinks like, oh, we actually understand each other, this could be interesting. And in their conversation, we do find out that Rose loves hockey in a real way. She grew up in Michigan, which is a huge hockey community, and both of her brothers played hockey to various levels of success. She mentions that one of her brothers played NCAA hockey and didn't make it past that, but that he did make it to the Frozen Four, which is the big hockey championship in college. Her other brother went undrafted, but plays in the AHL, which is the minor league. I will say it is kind of funny that they aren't able to use the NHL, but they do mention the AHL here. I do love the idea that the AHL in this universe is feeding the MLH, because the AHL really is the league that is the junior league for the NHL. We have a couple of different minor leagues that do feed into the NHL, so if you're new to hockey, the way that the AHL works, as well as other minor leagues, is that players who don't make it into the NHL play on these minor league teams. Those teams are affiliated with an NHL team, and sometimes you'll see players called up for full-time contracts, and other times when the NHL players are injured, you'll see AHL players called up for a certain number of games while they need to kind of deal with the fact that they're down a man. So this hockey family that she comes from is decent enough to kind of be in the AHL playing in the minors, but not great enough to get anybody into the NHL, which also sort of makes Rose the biggest star of her family, just like Shane. And one thing I really loved about the women in Shane and Ilya's life is that we have these two women that are able to sort of capture Ilya and Shane's attention and maintain relationships with them. And both of them, Svetlana and Rose, are very much like hockey fanatics. They're able to hold a conversation about this extreme amount of knowledge about the sport, and at times Svetlana in particular seems to know more than Ilya does. Rose is able to capture Shane's attention because of how much she knows about hockey, because of how big of a fan she is of hockey, and because of how deeply she can discuss it. But unlike we've seen women portrayed in other pieces of media when they are either athletes themselves or obsessed with a sport, both Svetlana and Rose are hyper feminine. Rose is literally a movie star. She's constantly pictured with makeup on, great hair, great outfits, she's shown in dresses, and she's shown being girly. And while Rose and Svetlana are not the purpose of this show or the main characters or kind of what we're exploring here, I personally, as a woman who loves sports and talks about them all the time and literally talks about them to camera for work, really appreciated the fact that for what felt like kind of the first time, we were able to see two female characters who have such extensive knowledge of a sport, but also aren't forced to kind of not have a feminine look to them, to not have femininity about them. Svetlana and Rose 100% embody their femininity, and their knowledge of hockey doesn't take away from that in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, that's part of the point as Shane goes through his own journey and understanding himself. But in terms of representation of women, which again is not the core point of this show, Rose and Svetlana represent real people and real women in this world and in this universe. Women who know everything about this sport, who love this sport very deeply, and who also embrace their femininity and don't allow themselves to be cut out of this space or force themselves to match an idea of how to fit in. When it comes to female hockey fans, there are so many different types of women that love this sport. Not all of them are hyper feminine, but very rarely do we see on TV in any sport at all women who love sports in a way that is completely individual to them and not something that's portrayed in a quote-unquote pick-me character or a not like other girls archetype who's constantly kind of spitting on the idea of what it means to be feminine. Rose and Svetlana were personally two of my very favorite characters in this show because of that, because it felt so refreshing to see women be able to love sports and portrayed as incredibly knowledgeable in them and not have some sort of excuse made up for their character as well. Oh, she's not like other girls and that's why she loves sports. Instead, we had two really well-crafted women who just genuinely loved the game, and that common interest is part of what attracts Shane and Ilya to them, in the same way that hockey is the through line that attracts them to each other. And then of course we have a couple of other moments as we get Rose's relationship with Shane starting to develop. Ilya of course finds out about Shane's relationship with Rose through gym talk, which I kind of loved this because there was this world where the other players are constantly looking at headlines of other NHL players, which we do see a little bit throughout the series. We see this later with Ilya missing his flight because he goes back to Russia, and of course we're seeing these moments of Shane's relationship being highlighted through league gossip. The fact that it's making it to another team, of course their rival team, and that they're talking about him dating a movie star is very fun. But it also kind of reminds you that again, every place that these guys turn, they're hearing everything about the other guy's life. And then we have Rose wear Shane's jersey to a game. We have them say on the announcements that this is going to upset a lot of Detroit fans. And one thing I found really funny about this is that I follow Lexi LaFleur Brown, who I think is an incredible author and such a fun kind of hockey person, who was married to an NHL player who's now retired and works as a broadcaster. And one of the things that she's talked about is the fact that it's considered gauche to wear your husband's jersey or your boyfriend's jersey to a game. So there's something so funny about seeing Rose do this because of course it's photographed, it's highlighted, and there's this big deal about it, and of course that's going to make it back to Ilya. But also knowing from real life wags that this is something that would be considered a little gauche by the other wags, there's something very funny about that. And also of course Rose is a literal movie star, so anything she does is going to be highlighted in this way, and of course as soon as she puts that jersey on, she knows exactly what she's doing. And then of course we end on this hockey game where they both play like absolute garbage. Montreal limps across the finish line with a 1-0 victory, and we see the way that Ilya and Shane's gameplay on the ice has changed along with their relationship ending. Ilya checks Shane into the boards, but all of the flirty energy is completely gone. He won't look at Shane when they're both on the bench, and the rest of the game we clearly get the idea that both of them are playing like garbage. And again, this is something that this show does really well, bringing the relationships of these players, not just Shane and Ilya, but also Scott in the last episode, and tying it to the way that their romantic relationships are working. To me, again, you'll hear me say this almost every episode that we break down. Hockey functions as a third person in each of these relationships, and it works both ways. Sometimes the better their relationships are going, the better the hockey is, and the worse their relationships are, the worse their hockey is. Through and through, hockey continues to remain the tie that holds them together and the single thing that keeps them apart. And there's not much hockey context left in the rest of this episode. Shane obviously goes to the club and sees Ilya, and then we end in the middle of something that I was like, why am I in it? Sort out your problems and leave me out of it. I will say the end of this episode makes me so stressed that I usually have to watch a little bit of episode 5 just to like cleanse my palate, but there is so much hockey in this episode. Hopefully breaking all of this down gave you a little bit more context to everything that was going on in their relationship in this episode, and also just reminded you that the creative team behind these characters and this show are genuinely geniuses. There is so much hockey knowledge and history and NHL references packaged into every single little episode. There are these tiny lines that you're like, oh my god, I didn't even recognize that, but there's a little reference. There's hockey history, there's hockey references. I think this show is so well crafted and this story is so beautifully done. And again, I genuinely think that the craft behind this show is not only why the show itself has been so astronomically successful, but also why it's causing fans to actually investigate the sport after watching it. In general, I just think this show is genuinely so well done, and I think it's making a lot of new hockey fans for very good reasons. So that wraps up episode 4 and leaves us in a horrendous cliffhanger. If you haven't watched the other 3 episodes, be sure to go back and watch those, and also check out the other sports romance reviews that I've done and other breakdowns that I've done on the channel. We'll be back next week with episode 5, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that or the cottage breakdown. And also, as we get to the end of this series, I would love to know if there are any other sports romance or sports media shows that you would like me to break down in this way. They can be books or TV shows or movies. I'm happy to break them down, and they don't have to be just hockey. It can be any sport at all. So leave those requests in the comments down below. Drop any other questions that you might have about hockey or the show itself, and of course be sure to subscribe so that you can come back next week when we break down episode 5.